Today I'm going to show you how to make a keto bone broth with low-carb vegetables and lots of anti-inflammatory herbs and spices, and rich on flavor. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome back to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, sourdough, ferments, and more. So if you enjoy learning about these types of things, be sure to subscribe to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Today I'm going to be making this keto bone broth in my slow cooker. Now this is a 10-quart slow cooker. You can also do this in a 10-quart stock pot on the stove. And I've got 5 pounds of bones. Now if you're using a smaller slow cooker or a smaller stock pot, then just decrease the poundage of bones. So for an 8-quart slow cooker, you'd want to go with about 4 pounds of bones, and for a 6-quart slow cooker, you'd want to go with about 3 pounds of bones. And the same would apply to the size of your stock pot. And you can also make this in a pressure cooker like the Instant Pot or the Mealthy, whatever one you might have. And the only difference is you're going to want to adjust the time for making bone broth according to the manufacturer's timetable and instructions. Now, as I said, I've got about 5 pounds of bones here, and I've got a selection. I've got marrow bones, I've got neck bones, and I have oxtails. I like to put in oxtails because they're very high in collagen, and they'll release a lot of that into the bone broth, which will help to make it gelatinous. And I like the marrow bones also for a similar reason. They are high in collagen, not as high as the oxtails, but you have more of them, so that definitely helps. And the acidulated water that they're going to be cooked in will help leach out the collagen of these marrow bones and also add to the gelatinous nature of the bone broth. But the main reason I like to use the marrow bones is for the marrow. I like to extract that from the bones and either use that to eat on toast points, so on and so forth. I've shared this with you before, or just whip it back into the bone broth. It's very nutritious. And the final bones I've got here are neck bones. They're sort of the best of all worlds because they've got some meat on them, some bone that'll be rich in collagen, and also some cartilage, which is also rich in collagen. Again, all of that cartilage and the collagen, or all of the collagen that'll be leached out of the bones and the collagen, serve to make the bone broth gelatinous. And as you know, I always like to have a gelatinous bone broth because that's very good at nourishing our bodies, our hair, our nails, our skin, and most importantly, our gut. And when we nourish our gut and we have good gut health, then we overall are healthy. Now I'm going to go ahead and put my marrow bones right into the slow cooker, and I'm going to add some water and the acid that I like to use. And I'm going to let them soak while the rest of these bones are browning. And the reason that I do that is because marrow bones don't really have a lot of meat on them, and they don't take on very much color. So instead, what I like to do is put them in the slow cooker or the stock pot and let them soak in the acidulated water while the rest of these meatier bones are roasting. And then I feel that gives them a little head start at beginning to allow the acidulated water to leach the collagen out of the bones before we start to cook. And now these I'm just going to let roast, and that will allow to add some nice color and flavor to the final product. Because sometimes when you just have marrow bones, you won't have much color, even if you do roast them, and you won't have much flavor. But if you've got some meaty bones, and the oxtails have some meat on them as well, they'll brown up nicely, we'll deglaze the pan, we'll add that to the slow cooker, and it'll add, as I said, color and flavor. And you'll really notice a difference in creating a flavorful broth when you do that. So now I'm going to go ahead and put these marrow bones into my slow cooker. Now for my acid, I like to use wine or a fortified wine, generally a fortified wine, like a Madeira or a Marsala or a red vermouth, port sherry, something along those lines. This is Madeira, and I'm just going to go ahead and add that in. And the reason that I like to use some sort of fortified wine is I find that both the flavor and the color help to, make a nice end product and a nice flavor, a nice flavored bone broth. You can certainly use vinegar. as your acid to help extract the collagen from the bones. However, if you do, that was 1 cup what I used of the fortified wine. If you use vinegar, I recommend using apple cider vinegar because it does have a little bit of a sweet flavor to it, and only using 1/4 cup. That will be sufficient to leach the nutrients and the collagen out of the bones, and hopefully the flavor, it won't impart that vinegary flavor to your final product. And now I'm going to add some filtered water to my slow cooker, just enough to cover the bones. Now I'm going to put these in the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes to roast and get nice and brown. Now while the marrow bones are soaking in the cold acidulated water and the other bones are roasting in the oven, I want to talk about the vegetables, herbs, and spices that we're going to be adding to our keto anti-inflammatory bone broth. In a previous video, I discussed what are some of the good vegetables to add to when you're making a keto bone broth. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and the description below. But of those, I'll show you the ones that I've picked to use today. And that includes romaine lettuce, spring onions or green onions, and some celery. Now we're not going to use this whole head of romaine lettuce, but we're going to pick a lot of the outside leaves and we're going to use those. They are romaine lettuce is very rich in vitamins. It's high in potassium, magnesium, calcium, and beta carotene, which turns into vitamin A, or your body converts it into vitamin A. So these are all wonderful nutrients to add into our bone broth to make it very rich in vitamins and minerals. And it's very low in carbohydrates, which I know is so important when you're following a keto diet to really keep your carbohydrates as low as possible. Next, we're going to be adding in some celery. Celery is wonderfully high in potassium, which is terrific for balancing the sodium and potassium levels in our body, because it always seems like we get plenty of sodium in our diet, but not always enough potassium. So that's why I like to add celery. Plus, again, very low in carbohydrates. And instead of using yellow onions, which are a little higher in carbohydrates, we're just going to use these nice little green onions. They're very low in carbohydrates, and not only are they rich in vitamins and minerals, they're also very high in anti-inflammatory properties. So you get the double benefit of not only getting vitamins and minerals, you have properties that are going to add to making this bone broth anti-inflammatory, which helps, obviously, as the name implies, calm inflammation in the body. And that, along with improving our gut health, thanks to the gelatin in the bone broth, we also want to calm inflammation. So we get 2 benefits, improving gut health and calming inflammation. And as scientists tell us, that's really the 1-2 punch, so to speak, to improving our health and keeping us healthy. And then what I've got here, is getting away from me, are some dried shiitake mushrooms. These are very high in nutrients. They're also vitamins and minerals, and they're also very high in anti-inflammatory properties. Plus, in speaking of vitamins and minerals, they're high in vitamin D. And often today, we don't get enough vitamin D because so many of us tend to avoid the sun or use sunscreen, which is how we normally would make the sun hitting our skin would make vitamin D in our body. But since so many of us are very careful about the sun, mushrooms are wonderful to have in our diet because they add vitamin D to it. And so we're going to add, and shiitakes are especially high in anti-inflammatory properties as well. So we're going to add these into our broth and get a lot of wonderful benefits. And what I've got here are some fresh herbs from my garden. I've got thyme, and I've got rosemary, and I've got fresh oregano. These, again, all high in anti-inflammatory properties, and oregano I love, and you could even add, this is a relatively small amount that I'm going to add in, and you can certainly use dried for any of these. Dried herbs will work beautifully as well, but I have a big herb garden, so I have a lot of fresh herbs, and so I like to use those. And oregano has a wonderful flavor. I'm sure you know it's very common with spaghetti sauce and so on and so forth. And I love oregano in bone broth. I think it adds a wonderful flavor. Plus, it's very high in vitamins, minerals, and it's very high in anti-inflammatory properties. All the oils that come from herbs are very anti-inflammatory and are very well known for calming inflammation in the body. Now, oregano, I have no problem with adding lots of this, so you feel free to be generous. But I do want to talk about rosemary and thyme. You need to be careful with rosemary, whether you use fresh or dried. And if you are going to use dried, start with, maybe no more than a half a teaspoon and see, or even maybe a quarter teaspoon, even in a big slow cooker like this, and see how you like it. And the same with fresh, I'm just going to put in 1 sprig because rosemary is strong and too much can taste soapy to many people. So you want to be very careful when you're using rosemary. But it's also very good for you. The oils that are released from the rosemary are very high in anti-inflammatory properties. So it's a wonderful herb to use. Just go gentle with it. And like rosemary and oregano as well, thyme, again, wonderful anti-inflammatory properties. I believe the essential oil, I guess is the proper word for it, that comes from thyme is pronounced maybe thymol or thymol. I'm not 100% sure. But again, it's a wonderful anti-inflammatory herb. But like rosemary, it can have a strong flavor. So you want to go easy with thyme because to some people it can taste a little medicinal. And what's interesting about thyme, it's often used to make home remedies that involve using it in a cough medicine. And I believe I have a video where I made a cough medicine, and I believe one of the herbs I used was dried thyme because it's this thymol that is very rich in anti-inflammatory properties, can really help to calm a cough, calm a sore throat, so on and so forth. But it can have a little bit of a medicinal flavor. So again, start slow. If you use dried herbs, dried thyme, start slow and build up to see what amount you like. I'd start with a quarter of a teaspoon, even in a large slow cooker or stock pot like this. And if you're going to use fresh, again, just start small and see what you like. But it's a wonderful herb, and I highly recommend using it because the anti-inflammatory properties that it offers can't be beat. Next, what I've got here is really this, along with the turmeric, which I'll show you in a minute, are really the stars of the show. These are very well known for their anti-inflammatory properties. And in the case of ginger, a wonderful flavor. And it adds a little bit of a nice spice. I know some of you have told me that you'd like your bone broth to have more flavor and almost to be like have a little bit of a spice to it. And ginger can really fill the bill. It can give it a nice flavor, a little bit of a spicy flavor, and at the same time add a lot of anti-inflammatory properties. And what I've got here is just a little bit of a rounded cup, and I just chopped it up. This is organic, and so I didn't remove the skin. You don't have to remove the skin, but if you want, you can. But since this was organic, I just left the skin on, and I just chopped it up. Nothing fancy. We'll just go ahead and put that right into our broth as is. And as I said, I have about a rounded cup chopped. You can certainly start with less. If you're not a fan of ginger or you're not comfortable with what it might taste like, you can just start with a small knob, an inch or two, even smaller than that, and experiment. Now, turmeric. Now we're really talking the star of the show. And if you've never seen fresh turmeric, and I want to mention, these are fresh, but you can use dried. And again, if you use dried, start small because the flavor of dried herbs and dried spices is more concentrated. So you may want to start with a quarter of a teaspoon and then over time work up and see what amount of flavor you like. But as I said, this is fresh turmeric. If you've not seen it, I left one piece whole so that you could see what it looks like. Similar to ginger, but often not as many knobs. You'll often see it in the grocery store just kind of straight like this. And at my grocery store, and I live in a small town and my grocery store carries it, it's even organic, and it just came in a little 6-ounce package like this, and when I chopped it up, it came to about a cup. And it's organic, so I didn't bother with peeling it. And as I said, it was 6 ounces, and it's a product of USA. So they might have it at your grocery store just in a bin, plain like this, or sold in one of these little packages. And you'll see it looks like a carrot, and it's very easy to peel, very easy to cut. And I just went ahead, as I said, left the skin on. And turmeric, very high in anti-inflammatory properties. You often see capsules of turmeric powder sold for people to take to help with aches and pains that they may have or other forms of inflammation. But what I like about using fresh turmeric and using it in some sort of broth or even making a tea, I have a video on making a spice mix using a ground turmeric that you add to milk, the golden milk that's very popular. And I like that very much. I like taking it in some sort of food form because I find taking the turmeric capsules to be very hard on my stomach. But when I take it in a broth or a milk, it's fine. And I believe that I do get a lot of anti-inflammatory properties from it because I always seem to feel better when I drink turmeric milk or turmeric broth, and turmeric bone broth in this case. So we've got about a cup there. Now, speaking of turmeric, we are going to add a good tablespoon of black peppercorns. And now I always add some peppercorns to my bone broth, but I'm adding more in this particular batch of anti-inflammatory keto bone broth because turmeric and black pepper go together. Black pepper helps your body absorb the anti-inflammatory properties that turmeric offers. So be sure to add a good handful, I've got about a tablespoon here, of black peppercorns. It's not going to impart a strong pepper flavor because they are whole, but it's going to help, the pepper will leach into the liquid that'll help combine nicely with the nutrients that leach, the anti-inflammatory nutrients that leach out of the turmeric, and both then together will allow your body to absorb all the wonderful benefits of the turmeric. And then finally, to all my bone broths, I always add a bay leaf or two. And again, like my other fresh herbs, this one is dry, but like the fresh herbs, it also offers a lot of inflammatory properties as well. And that's just sort of always my little signature. I always add a bay leaf, so that'll go into our bone broth as well. Well, these bones have soaked in the acidulated water, the marrow bones. I just got these out of the oven. They're roasted up beautifully. I've turned the slow cooker up to high, and now I'm going to go ahead and add in these bones and bring this up to a boil. And now we're going to go ahead and deglaze this pan to get all these wonderful bits. The fond is what it's called, all these wonderful brown bits that will add flavor and a good color to our final product, our final bone broth. And I'm just going to go ahead and loosen up all of these bits. And now I'm going to go ahead and add all of these drippings from the deglazed pan. Ah, perfect. And then I'll just get the last of all of these bits and bobs and add them into the slow cooker. And now I'm just going to skim off some of the foam that rises to the top. And now we're going to go and add in all of the vegetables. I took some of the outer leaves from that romaine lettuce, washed them up, and chop them up here. Nothing needs to be fancy, just a rough cut. With the lettuce, I actually just tore it. And we're going to go ahead and add in all of our vegetables now. The onions. We'll put everything up like this, make it a little easier. Get all these onions in. Then we'll go ahead and get our celery in there, and we'll get in our mushrooms and our herbs. Now we'll go in and go ahead and add in our ginger, and we'll go ahead and add in our turmeric, our cut up turmeric, beautiful. And now we'll go ahead and add in the peppercorns. And now we're just going to top all this off with a little bit more of filtered water, just to cover. And I like to stay within an inch of the rim. I don't like to come higher than the rim because I've learned from experience that as this cooks, even though it's not going to be boiling, it sometimes expands and can leak over the sides a little. So I like to go up no higher than within an inch of the rim. Then what I'm going to do is put this top on, and I'm just going to, this particular slow cooker just has these little things to lock down, but if yours doesn't, don't worry about it. And then I'm going to take this dial and I'm going to turn this on mine. I believe that's warm. And I'm going to simmer this for 12 hours on warm. And the reason is my slow cooker on warm is 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is the perfect temperature for simmering broth to get all of the nutrients out, to get all of the collagen leached out of the bones, and to create a nice gelatinous bone broth. Often at higher temps it can break the gelatin. You might still get somewhat of a gelatinous bone broth, but it won't be as dense, I guess is maybe the right word, or as gelatinous. I always laugh when I say that, as almost like Jell-O. You're looking for a gelatinous bone broth that once it's refrigerated is as thick or as gelatin-like as Jell-O. You don't want a loose gelatin, and if you keep it at 180 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll get a nice thick gelatin. Now, if you're doing this on the stove top, chances are the lowest setting on your stove top will simmer the bone broth at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're really just looking for bloop, bloop. I always say this, when I explain about making bone broth. You're just looking for little bubbles here and there, bloop, bloop, bloop. Nothing dramatic, not a boil, nothing like that. Now, if you're doing this in a slow cooker and you find after testing this, when it comes up to a boil, and then you're going to just skim the foam as we did, then you're going to turn it down to warm, give it a little time to cool down from the boil that you brought it up to, and then test it with a meat thermometer and see what it registers at. If it registers higher than 180 degrees Fahrenheit, nothing to worry about. You can just tilt the lid. That'll allow some of the steam to escape and some of the heat to escape as well, bringing the temperature down to 180 degrees. So you can just do it like that, and that will allow the broth not to boil and will allow you to create a nice gelatinous bone broth. So since we're making beef bone broth here, and in particular our keto bone broth, but any beef bone broth in general, when done on the stovetop or in a slow cooker, is going to simmer for 12 hours. Chicken bone broth, on the other hand, simmers for 6 hours. But beef bone broth, in order to leach out a good amount of collagen from the bones, is going to simmer for 12 hours. So I will see you back, which will be tomorrow morning, after 12 hours of simmering this overnight. And I'll show you how we strain it and decant it. Well, this bone broth has simmered for 12 hours in the slow cooker, basically overnight. And now I'm going to get ready to strain out the vegetables, and then we'll remove the bones. Well, I've got all the vegetables out and all the bones out. Now, the vegetables are pretty much spent. I think for the most part, all of the nutrition has been extracted from them, along with the herbs and spices. And I have a friend who said that she rinses these all off and puts them in her compost pile, and they do great. So that's a nice tip that I learned. And regarding the bones, if you are ready to do a second batch, you've got a couple of options. You can either take all the meat out and use that in a recipe to make a soup or whatever the case may be, or you can rebrown the meat to get some nice color, the neck meat and the oxtail meat, to get some nice color and get ready to make a second batch of broth. I don't really think you need to roast the marrow bones. As you see, I don't roast them in the beginning, and now they have no meat on them. They're really not going to take on much color. So if you are ready to make another batch of bone broth, what I would recommend is put them back into your slow cooker, let them soak in the acidulated water while you brown up the meat, or rebrown up the meat, and then deglaze the baking sheet or the roasting pan, whatever you're browning them in, and add that to your slow cooker and just proceed as we did before. Now, if you're not ready to make another batch of bone broth, no problem. Wrap these well, and you can refrigerate them up to 2 days. Some people will say 3 days. I really think that 2 days is good. You don't want them to take on any sort of off odor, because then that would go into your bone broth. Now, if you say, well, geez, I'm not even going to make them in 2 days, then I'm not going to make any bone broth in 2 days, then you can freeze them. And you can freeze them up to 2 months, possibly 3 months. I like to use them up within 2 months because at some point they can start to take on a little freezer burn. And then again, that can put in an off flavor into your bone broth. So you've got some options as to what to do with your bones. And now what I've got on this plate over here is the bone marrow that's come out of the marrow bones. It's just floating here in a little bit of the beef tallow. And what you can do with this is you can either whip this back into your bone broth, the finished product, once we strain it, and that adds wonderful nutrition, or you can simply use you can use this like you would butter and put it on toast. It's very delicious and very nutritious. And I have to tell you, the aroma coming from this bone broth is just fabulous. All of those herbs and spices have given it such a lovely aroma, and I'm confident it's going to have a wonderful flavor too. Now, those of you who have been with me for a while know the process I go through and how I like to strain my broth, but we'll definitely do that again for those of you who are new. And I just want to say that you do have some various options as to how you go about straining your broth. What I'm going to show you is the way I like to do it, but I'll also explain the other ways that you can go about straining this. I like to start with using a fat separator so that I separate, obviously, the fat from the bone broth. And the reason that I do this is because my husband and I enjoy drinking the bone broth without the fat mixed into it. We just prefer the mouthfeel. But I don't discard the beef fat, what's known as tallow. I save it, I keep it in my refrigerator, and I use it for sautéing or frying. It's wonderful. So I'll show you in a minute the process that I go through, but I just want to say that if you don't want to go through this process and you don't mind having the fat in your bone broth, you can simply take a ladle and scoop this out and pour it through a strainer into the vessel that you want to store it in. Now, I recommend using a strainer to catch any little bits and bobs that we weren't able to remove when we were just spooning things out and separating the bones from the vegetables. Then what you'll have is your bone broth that you've just strained through a strainer, no cheesecloth, no flour sack towel, nothing. And what you'll find is after you refrigerate this, the fat will float to the top and form a solid mass. It almost makes pretty much an airtight seal. It'll form a solid mass, and you can remove that, and then you can scoop out your gelatinous bone broth. And then on the bottom, you'll see the little bits of debris that have sunk to the bottom that I normally like to catch with my cheesecloth, but if you don't want to go through this step, no problem, or my flour sack towel, and then you can just discard that little bit of debris that's on the bottom. And speaking of the fat that will form on top, and it making somewhat of an airtight seal, allows you to store your bone broth refrigerated for a little bit longer than if you didn't have that fat on top. If you have the fat on top, I think it stays fresh for about a week. Some people have said 2 weeks. If you don't have the fat on top, you should probably be drinking it within 2 to 3 days, if it's refrigerated. Now, if you want to decant it into smaller storage vessels and you want to freeze it, you can certainly do that. You can do it with the fat or without the fat. And generally frozen, a lot of people say, it's good for up to 6 months. I find it can get a little freezer burn, at that point. I think if you use it within 2, maybe 3 months, you're going to have your best flavor and your least chance of freezer burn. But you can certainly freeze it just in some sort of freezer-proof container. And I'll link in the iCards and in the description below to 2 other bone broth videos I have that are very long and very complete tutorials. One is on how to make beef bone broth, and the other one is on how to make chicken bone broth. And each of those I should go into a lot of detail as to how I store both of those, whether I'm going to refrigerate them or freeze them. And so that can help too if you're thinking of what options you want for storing your bone broth. And as I said, I'll link to those. So today I'm just using a measuring cup, a large measuring cup, so that you can see what I'm doing. Normally I would put my strainer over another, a stock pot or some larger vessel so that I could just strain all of this in one fell swoop. But I want you to be able to see exactly what I'm doing. Now I'm going to take this flour sack towel. These are very reasonable. These I've had for years. You can buy them at any of the big box stores. I like them better than cheesecloth because they're more economical. Cheesecloth, really only lasts for a couple of uses and then it needs to be discarded. And some people will discard it right after the first use. And if you have a busy household, I completely understand that. But I do like these flour sack towels. So I get that ready. Then I take my fat separator, and all I do is start to take my broth and put it in here. And then what's going to happen is the fat is going to rise to the top and the bone broth will be underneath the fat. And then in this particular fat separator, which I love, it's a very clever design. It has a little hole in the bottom and a little lever over here. And once the fat rises to the top, I'm just going to press the lever and allow all the broth to drain through the flour sack towel, through the strainer, into the vessel below. And then I'm going to stop right when the fat gets down to the bottom. Now the fat has risen to the top, right over here. I'll put a picture in so you can see it a little clearer. And now I'm just going to depress this lever and have the broth drain through this flour sack towel and the strainer. Well, I've got all the broth out of that batch, and now I'm going to decant the fat into another vessel, a little container here, that I'll keep in my refrigerator for when I want to cook with it. And now I'll fill this up again, and we'll get ready to strain another batch. Well, my measuring cup is getting a little bit full, so I'm going to decant this into a half-gallon jar. This is just a canning jar. This is how I like to store my beef bone broth, because I'll put this, I'm dripping a little, I'll put this in my refrigerator, and then my husband and I just scoop out what we want in the morning, and we will definitely go through this within 2 to 3 days. And here is a picture of my flour sack towel after I've strained all the bone broth. And this is all the debris that I like to catch so as to have a very clarified bone broth in the end. Well, each of these jars is a half a gallon, 8 cups, and I filled both of them to the 8-cup mark, so that's a total of 16 cups of bone broth that I was able to make from 5 pounds of bones in a 10-quart slow cooker. And I'll link to a video, actually that I made yesterday, that I uploaded yesterday, where I go down, or I break down the cost of making this bone broth. And this is a lot less expensive, even when using organic grass-fed bones, than what I was able to buy at my grocery store. And not only was it considerably less expensive to make homemade, the quality of the homemade was considerably better. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards, that video in the iCards and in the description below. Check it out, because I think you'll be surprised, because many of us were originally thinking that maybe what we made homemade was very costly. Certainly the quality is always going to be better homemade, but was it really worth it? And we discovered that it was. It makes more sense to make it homemade. You're going to get a better quality product for less money. And I still have a little bit more in my measuring cup here. Almost, I'd say it's about a cup or so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this, I'm going to put it in the refrigerator and let it chill up so we can see the level of gelatinousness. I always laugh when I say that, how gelatinous this particular batch came. And in addition to all this wonderful bone broth that I have, I also have a wonderful amount of beef tallow that's basically infused with all those herbs and spices, giving it double benefit. Not only the benefit of how nutritious tallow is, but now it's infused with ginger and garlic and the other herbs and vegetables that we used. And so this is going to be wonderful to cook with. Not only will it be nutritious, but it'll also impart a lot of wonderful flavor. And I just want to get back to talking about the cost of making this. I have very good news that some of you have asked me, well, Mary, where do you get your bones? And I've shared with you, that I get them at the grocery store, or the specialty grocery stores, or the farmer's market. But my favorite place to get bones is to order them online from U.S. Wellness Meats. And the folks at U.S. Wellness Meats have been wonderful, because they gave me a promo code, a coupon code, discount code, whatever you want to call it, for my viewers to get 15% off regularly priced items. And they have got a wonderful selection of bones, plus all kinds of meat, chicken, and chicken feet, which we will be discussing in future videos. And so I wanted to share that with you, and I will put the link below in the description below. So be sure to check that out, because that's 15% off regularly priced items. So that's a wonderful savings if you do buy bones online. Well, I've poured a little bit of this in a glass. I'll go ahead and put this in the fridge. We'll let it gel up, and we'll see how it does. While that's chilling in the fridge, I just want to talk about some specifics when it comes to making bone broth. Now, I have a video, which I'll link to in the iCards and in the description below, called What's the Difference? I'm not sure of the exact title, but it's along the lines of what's the difference between broth, stock, and bone broth. Now broth, just plain broth, is generally made with meaty bones, a small amount of bone and a lot of meat. You brown it up, you add some water, some aromatics, whatever you want, and you simmer it for about 45 minutes and no longer than 2 hours. And you make a very nice protein-rich broth. Now stock, on the other hand, is made just with bones that have very little, if any, meat on them. And usually when making stock, you'll use something like a marrow bone or a knuckle bone or a patella bone, which is the kneecap. And what you do when it comes to making stock is you'll take those marrow bones or your knuckle or your patella and your vegetables, and you'll put everything on a baking sheet and roast it in the oven until everything is nice golden brown. Now your bones are not going to take on a lot of color because there's not a lot of meat on them, but the vegetables will. And the little bit of meat that is on those bones will also take on some color. Then the next thing you do is you transfer all those vegetables and those bones to your stock pot, cover with water, the same way you would do if you were making broth, and you just cover it with water just enough to make sure everything's submerged, about an inch above, and then you simmer that for maybe 2 to 3 hours at most. And to that water, when you make stock, you're also going to add some sort of acid, a little bit of vinegar, a little bit of wine, or a little bit of a fortified wine. And the reason you do that, as opposed to broth where you do not add any acid, because there's a very small bone and you're simmering it for a very short period of time and you're focusing on the protein that's coming out of the muscle meat, with stock, you want to extract as much collagen from those bones as possible, because that's what's going to make your stock gelatinous. And stock is gelatinous versus broth, which is not gelatinous. And stock is very high in collagen. And now, collagen is a protein. It's just a different type of protein that is what's in muscle meat. So your broth is very high in protein and considered a protein-rich liquid. Stock is also rich in protein, but a different type of protein, what we call collagen. And collagen has many benefits because of the gelatin and how that nourishes our body. Gelatin-rich liquids like stock and like bone broth nourish our hair, our nails, our skin, and especially our guts. And we hear from scientists how important it is to keep our gut nourished, because a well-nourished gut, and gelatin is very good at doing that, creates an environment that allows the probiotics to flourish and the good bacteria. And it's that good bacteria in our gut that can keep us healthy. So when you have a short period of time and you want to make a gelatin-rich liquid, stock is an excellent option because you can do that in 2 to 3 hours. So you may be asking, well, Mary, if stock is gelatin-rich, why am I worried about making bone broth, which I have to simmer in a slow cooker or in a stock pot on the stove for 12 hours? Well, I'll tell you. Bone broth is a combination of all the best worlds. When you make bone broth, you use meaty bones, so you get the protein from the muscle meat, and you use generally marrow bones, where you extract collagen from them, and you also get the marrow in the marrow bones that you can either eat separately or whip back into your bone broth. And the protein that's in the muscle meat is different than the protein that's in collagen. So you're getting a nice selection, so to speak, of proteins that serve different processes in the body. Plus, when you make bone broth, you generally add a third type of bone, which is a bone that is exceptionally rich in collagen. And that'll usually be like your neck bones, your oxtails, your patellas, your knuckles, something along those lines, which makes bone broth even more gelatin-rich than stock. So bone broth offers you the proteins that come from muscle meats, the proteins that come from collagen, plus extra collagen from those high cartilage bones that you add in. So you've got your meaty bones, your marrow bones, and then your high cartilage bones, because they offer even more collagen than what can be extracted from marrow bones. So broth is a nice high protein liquid to make when you're in a rush and you only have maybe 45 minutes and you want to have a nice base for soups. Stock is a nice gelatin-rich liquid that you can make in 2 to 3 hours. That's wonderfully rich for also using for soups, but primarily for making nice sauces and gravies. But then finally, you have bone broth, which is the best of all worlds and has the protein from the meaty bones, the protein from the collagen that comes from the marrow bones, as well as the protein that comes from the collagen of your high cartilage bones that also add extra gelatin. Well, I put a little bit of the bone broth into a dish here so that I can take a taste. The aroma is wonderful. The ginger, the turmeric comes through, the green onions. Oh, that's delicious. Oh, I really like it. It's a wonderful bone broth. Nothing is overpowering. The ginger is not overpowering, not the rosemary, not the turmeric. It all comes together beautifully and makes a wonderful, wonderful keto bone broth with anti-inflammatory herbs and spices. It's just perfect. Now let's get that little bit of bone broth out of the refrigerator and see how gelatinous it is. Look at what a beautiful gelatinous bone broth we've made. Look at that. That is gelatinous. Let me go in with a spoon. Oh yeah, look at that. Like Jell-O. This is exactly how I like bone broth to be. Look at that. I get a nice big scoop of it here. Beautiful. I'll take a close-up picture. If you'd like to learn more about traditional nutrient-dense cooking, be sure to subscribe to my channel and then click on this video over here where I go over a whole host of anti-inflammatory herbs and spices perfect for bone broth. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.